Welcome to my short documentary inquiry into whether curriculum overload is preventing deep learning in middle school. My investigation is divided into four sections. First, I will introduce my issue, explain its significance, and discuss my original assumptions. Second, I will present my inquiry journey, including my research, interviews, survey findings, challenges, and changes in thinking. Third, I reflect on the capabilities I developed throughout the process. Last of all, I will consider what I would change and where this inquiry could lead next. Additional sources and interview evidence will be included in the description of this documentary. My inquiry investigated whether curriculum overload prevents deep and meaningful learning in middle school. After the consideration of many different problems affecting middle school education, I concluded that curriculum overload was the most damaging because it contributes to student stress, disengagement, rushed teaching, and a variety of other smaller issues. Curriculum overload is personally meaningful to me because I have experienced times when I felt drained balancing tasks from several subjects. This sparked the start of my questioning on whether covering more content will always produce better learning or whether it prevents students from experiencing deeper learning. Before anything happened, I assumed that curriculum overload affected students, teachers, and the school system. I thought students felt pressured to complete work quickly, while teachers had to prepare and move rapidly through topics, plan each lesson, and mark large amounts of work. This led to my first assumption that curriculum overload was just about an excessive amount of content that was required to be complete. However, as I started to research and gain knowledge on this topic, I realized that the actual problem was much more complicated. It turned out that curriculum overload involved duplicated content, completing curriculum priorities, limited teaching time, and a big difference between surface and deep learning. In order to get a better understanding of what curriculum overload really is, I examined sources and in international education reports, conducted written surveys, and gathered data from completed direct interviews. One of my first sources was a Bush Ahmed's article, Understanding Curriculum Overload, Causes and Implication. The article explained curriculum overload occurs when students are expected to learn too much content within a small amount of time. The article suggested overload skills and content without removing pre-existing duplicated material. This reduces the time available for teachers to teach new concepts and the time available for deeper learning. A key takeaway from the source was the difference between surface learning and deep learning. Surface learning is typically when students rely on memorizing information, while deep learning involves understanding and applying the knowledge. This supported my original belief that students were expected to learn too much too quickly, but it also demonstrated that overload was not caused by individual teachers, but also be a result from decisions made from the education system. The source was helpful, but I wanted a stronger piece of evidence. This led me to investigate OECD's book, which was called Curriculum Overload: A Way Forward. This was published in 2020. I considered this source as more credible and authoritative compared to the last one because it gathered and utilized international findings from many education systems. I have recognized that international findings may not represent every individual school, so to solve this issue, I decided to conduct surveys and gather evidence from my own school. The OECD described some curricula as a mile wide and an inch deep. This demonstrates how students may be required to learn a wide range of content, but they aren't learning that content deeply. The report has also highlighted that curriculum overload occurs when new learning priorities are added without removing existing and older content, which is very similar to the points in Ahmed's article. For example, OECD has indicated that literacy, mathematics, science, and languages spends on average 53% of the whole curriculum in OECD's countries in middle school education. This clearly demonstrates how curriculum overload is not just about the total amount of content, but how it also involves decisions on which areas receive the highest priority and amount of time. Another possible cause was unnecessary duplication across subjects and year levels. Although repetition can reinforce learning, unnecessary duplication reduces time for the other concepts. This information really changed my thinking because I originally viewed curriculum overload as just a student's workload issue. Now, OECD's book allowed me to recognize it as a curriculum design issue, which involves duplicated content and priorities. The information I got from these sources helped shape my interview questions, and I wanted to discover whether students and teachers in my own school experienced the issues in the research. I received 5 written responses in my written survey findings. 3 from Year 10 students, 1 from a Year 12 student, and 1 from a mathematics teacher who teaches both middle and senior school classes. As the sample size was small and included different schools and ages, I concluded it cannot represent each middle school student or teacher. However, it provided valuable insights. Observing the results, 60% of the participants believed their school had an overloaded curriculum. However, all 5 agreed that excessive school increases stress and disengagement. They explained how heavy workloads limits the attention they can allocate to each task, and how it reduces their time available for other outside commitments. In particular, the teacher's response explained how students' main focus may be meeting assessment deadlines rather than deeply understanding new topics. She had observed her students staying awake through the night to complete and meet deadlines. These responses supported my assumption that workload can affect well-being and learning. However, most of the participants also believed they were given enough time to understand topics. This challenged my thinking because it suggested that the issue may not lie on the speed of the lesson, but possibly the pressure that arises from overlapping deadlines, homework, and outside commitments. Another finding was that curriculum overload was subjective. The teacher explained students in the extension classes may experience a greater overload than others, while other students described their workload as manageable. I also conducted direct interviews with 10 of my classmates using closed questions. The responses was organized into 4 themes: workload, pace of learning, depth of understanding, and student well-being. For the workload section, all 10 participants stated they had to use time outside of school to complete their schoolwork regularly. 7 said school affected outside activities like sport, and 6 regularly received homework from multiple subjects a day. For the pace of learning section, 9 out of 10 felt rushed when moving across topics. All 10 believed some topics were covered too quickly, and 9 found it difficult to stay ahead, let alone keep up with each subject. For depth of understanding, 9 out of 10 expressed how they moved past older contents because there was too much new material required to learn. 9 also said they memorized content at times instead of genuinely understanding it. Only 4 out of the 10 felt confident in the material they had learned. These results correlated heavily with the mile-wide and inch-deep curriculum's description from OECD. For students' well-being, 9 stated that learning new content usually created stress or demotivation. The direct interviews produced numerical patterns, while the longer survey gave more detailed responses. By comparing both of the methods, it allowed me to gain a better understanding of the impact of curriculum overload. The direct interview suggested how students felt rushed and relied on memorization, while the longer survey demonstrated that participants felt the amount of lesson time was sufficient. This indicated that pressure may derive from the combined demand of several subjects rather than just each lesson. During this inquiry process, I encountered many limitations. The longer survey only received 5 responses, and my direct interviews was extremely closed by having just yes or no questions. Some questions may also have been leading as they suggested a negative effect before the participants have answered. While the yes or no format allowed an easier comparison of the findings, it did not explain the reason for each response. I adapted by grouping the findings into 4 sections and used the written responses to explain the numerical patterns. If I was to repeat this inquiry, I would definitely survey a larger number of middle school students and teachers. Instead of using yes or no questions, I would use rating scales, neutral wording, and follow-up questions. Throughout this inquiry, I developed several capabilities. You can see this in my capabilities audits. By observing the capabilities audits, it was evident that my strongest capability was quality thinking, and I used this when evaluating sources, comparing what was qualitative and quantitative data, identifying patterns, and altering my thinking and conclusions when my findings opposed my beliefs. An example of this is when my direct interviews suggested that many students relied on memorization because they felt rushed, but my longer survey contradicted this by demonstrating how some students believed that they had enough time during lessons to have a good understanding. This difference allowed me to form a more nuanced conclusion that curriculum overload also involves several other factors such as students' individual circumstances. One major challenge was the organization of a large amount of research, survey responses, and the tally data. To overcome this obstacle, I decided to group my findings into 4 themes: workload, learning pace, depth of understanding, and students' well-being. This allowed me to convey my evidence more effectively. Going back to the capabilities audit, my weakest capability was principled action. Although I had considered consent, privacy, and social liability, some of my survey questions, especially ones in the direct interview, may have been leading, and my yes or no format was very limiting for the participant. After this whole inquiry, I now understand curriculum overload is unable to be solved by just removing large amounts of content. Now, with my knowledge, I believe schools should now prioritize the most important concepts, reduce the amount of unnecessary repetition, and give students more than enough time to fully understand and apply what they have learned. The OECD supports a balanced approach between how deep and much content is covered in the curriculum, while Edutopia suggests clearer instructions and more focused learning goals. I would also improve the coordination between subjects because my findings have demonstrated overlapping assessments, homework, and unclear task expectations can form pressure even when students feel they have enough time during individual lessons. To reduce this problem's effect, I would recommend a shared assessments calendar and clearer rubrics. Schools can take further action by surveying more middle school students and teachers to gather further insights into what they actually feel and if changes are necessary to satisfy their mental well-being. In these surveys, rating scales and follow-up questions should be used instead of yes or no responses. Schools could then trial changes such as reducing duplicated content, managing deadlines, and increasing students' time to consolidate their understanding of key concepts. During this entire inquiry, my thinking has shifted countless times, and it started viewing curriculum overload as just too much content, to understanding the issue as a bigger and more complicated problem involving the curriculum design, assessment timing, and students' individual circumstances. I also learned more about students and teachers themselves. Their interview responses have conveyed that students do not all experience curriculum pressure in the same way because their circumstances, such as their workload, subjects, abilities, and commitments, are all unique and different. Teachers are also able to recognize when students are feeling overwhelmed, but they may be restricted by the requirements of the curriculum, assessment deadlines, and the amount of content they are expected to teach. This inquiry demonstrated that curriculum overload was more complex than just having too much content. It turns out that rushed learning, overlapping assessments, unclear expectations, duplicated material, and the uniqueness of each student are all involved. My research suggests that when learning moves too quickly, students may experience stress, reduced confidence, and a greater reliance on memorization. Through this inquiry, I was able to develop stronger capabilities when comparing evidence, identifying limitations, and adjusting my thinking. The ultimate takeaway of this documentary is that schools should make learning more purposeful and focused on deep understanding. Thank you for listening to my documentary on why middle school is broken because of an overloaded curriculum.